response to existentialism, and that's what I was going for, in this meetup, that we can explore the way these other philosophies, they don't exactly come out of existentialism, but they shape themselves in response. And so the contrasts I find are really interesting. So that's just as an aside of what we're doing. Why are we reading Marcuse in a group on existentialism? Well, he is a key critic, and he even has a little criticism of Sartre even in this essay. So just clarifying that.
There's one other thing I was going to mention. I should mention it now. I noticed that his career with the OSI was writing propaganda, writing anti-Nazi, or in other words, anti-German propaganda in 1942. So that's an interesting fact about him. Part of his career, his CV is learning to write propaganda, and that is part of like his writing style. I think there is this idea that he wants you to believe what he believes, because by using effective narrative. That was the point I wanted to make.
Great, thanks, James. Again, if anybody has like an immediate response to what someone else has said, like James right now, feel free to to jump in. And otherwise, I'll just go down. I'll kind of go down the list of hands. And you can find the list of hands that are up under the participants window, so you can open that function on your.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that a little bit.
Sure. For James.
I find his writing style very very illuminating. He's trying to make a point, and he's trying to argue, for that point of view, and I think he's pretty effective. I mean, much clearer than some of the other writers, and I think he is making his point, though, and I think it's an interpretation of Freud that is also very edifying. I learned a lot more about Freud in this paper, in addition to what I knew about him before, and it helped me understand Freud much better. But in the context of Marxism, I think it was also helpful, because he brings in how labor, productive labor plays a role in the psychological development of the individual, from eros to sublimation and repression. So those ideas are very, very important to understanding Freud, and it's helpful because Sartre was also writing on Marxism and also on Freudianism. He wrote a lot of essays on Freud as well, and he's trying to bring those points of view, ways of understanding our individual humanity to the table, along with existentialism. So he's trying to, so what Sartre is doing is trying to, understand Marx and Freud, and from the position of existentialism. And Marcuse is trying to understand, give us an interpretation of the individual and humanity from the perspective of Freud and Marx, and critiquing, traditional Western metaphysics and Sartre's transcendentalism. He referred to Sartre as a transcendentalist, a Cartesian transcendentalist, which is quite appropriate. So yeah, I think it's I think it's good to point out the positive, as well as the negatives about his writing.
Could I just say something about his style?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just quickly. I was interested to hear that James said he wrote propaganda, because I think that if that's true, then what this essay does is sort of situates us on that very uncomfortable line between propaganda and good old persuasive writing. And so we might not feel too comfortable with it at times, because then you don't know whether you're crossing that line and getting into assumptions when you should be sticking to logic. And that's probably why I liked reading it. I didn't find it that difficult. So I just wanted to jump in and say that I was a former English teacher, so I have this thing about persuasive writing and stuff like that.
Yeah, great points. And I mean, in our group here, this notion of ambiguity has come up quite a bit. We spent 4 or 5 weeks reading The Ethics of Ambiguity, right, by Simone de Beauvoir. And it's interesting to me that ambiguity is coming up again. I think that's actually it's an important kind of a technical term in psychoanalysis, like in clinical practice. That's part of a diagnosis or part of identifying the problem. So it's interesting that all the ways that it's showing up, like as you guys are saying, right up to the writing style and this ambiguity of, are we reading propaganda here, kind of Marxist Freudian, propaganda of some kind, or is this is this theoretical writing? Is it philosophy? Lots of boundaries are getting blurred. And I think that's part of, there's something about the theory itself, I think, that leads in that direction. Maybe there's something about boundaries itself that ends up being repressive, part of this reality principle that is creating so much suffering. I do want to turn us to John, who's been waiting patiently, and also Mark is in the queue.
Sure. Hey, Alex. So you mentioned the apparatus in this essay, and I would just like to add that the apparatus seems to be bent on productivity and the advancement of society, seemingly to no end. And regarding James' point, regarding his ethical view, I'd like to ask him, what is that exactly?
John, do you mean whose ethical view? What is?
Yeah, I can go through it quickly if you like. It's up to you, Alex.
Yeah, no, go for it. Go for it, Jim.
Okay. The first thing is the idea that I guess it's the civilization is based upon the suppression of the libido. So this is the idea in Marx, and I mean, it is the idea in the Freud book. The Freud book talks about the civilization having a lot to do with the suppression of libido. You can't have sex. You can't even express yourself completely freely in a sensuous way in society. And of course, Germans have a bit of that ethic. In East Germany, they had vacation camps and nudist colonies and things like that. So there was this kind of like a more healthy sexual ethic in going on in Germany, perhaps when Marcuse was growing up, that Germans can relate to probably better than Americans. And then, although we have that ethic now it's turned around. Now basically the forward sexual ethic is more coming out of the U.S. probably as much as any other place in the world. And then we have the number 2 is the civilization, that the idea that civilized ethics rests on conformist rationality, which was in Plato's writing. So it's basically the Platonic idea and the idea that ethics derives out of the rational idea. And then the third leg of his ethical theory is the Marxist principle of alienation, that every time you work, you're actually contributing to your own alienation, that society dictates that you become more alienated the more work you do. So that's the third part of his theory here in this essay.
Thank you.
But he also says that work can also be a form of a very, you know, pleasure. It can be a form of pleasure. It can be a form of enjoyment.
What says that, James?
Yeah, that he says that work can also be a form of enjoyment. So,
says
no,
that. Yeah.
because it's an expression of the erotic, you know, drive, and that you know, it can be a form of creativity, and I think he says it right there. I have to find the passage, but the problem that he's pointing out is that under domination, work turns into a kind of restriction of suppression of that kind of pleasure.
Yeah,
So he's not
okay.
saying that all work is, you know, is bad and so forth. It's not that. It's that a certain kind of repressive, you know, dominant nation that forces people to work, you know, without any free time and so forth, and this kind of, you know, suppression of the pleasure principle. So there is a kind of, he does say that you know, pleasure can be a form of I mean, work can be a form of pleasure. I think he says it's also almost necessary that that the civilization can be can also be viewed as an expression of eros, but under domination, you know, it's a different matter. It becomes a form of denial of the pleasure principle.
He actually says that on page 22, which was the only I was looking for that. I was looking for when he would talk about work as pleasure, and he says man begins working because he finds pleasure in work, not only after work, pleasure in the play of his faculties and the fulfillment of his life needs. But that was the only reference to the pleasure of work that I found.
Yeah, right.
You know, I think, thanks, guys. I'll just jump in because I'll comment on this. Maybe he means there a work which is not alienated, because on page 7 he distinguishes between the subject object, you know, that strange conglomeration he uses, subject dash object of pleasure into a subject object of work. And he also talks kind of early on about the desexualization of the body, which makes work possible and makes the toleration of the monotony of work possible. So there might be a tension there in the relationship of work and pleasure. And I'll just jump in with my question then. Was I next, Alex?
Yeah, pretty much, Mark. Yeah, go ahead with it, and then I'll
okay. Well, I really,
sure everybody gets a turn.
I really liked your intro, and I think you referred to the society as a totalizing unity. And in the part that, and as well as trying to distinguish Marcuse from Sartre, but I think that we can also find maybe some common ground just in the idea of this subject-object thing, conglomeration that Marcuse is talking about, as well as mentioning the idea of a project for the future. I think there might be some grounds for common ground. But really what I wanted to ask about was, in the part that you started off reading, that starts off with this idea of freedom as domination. I think there are paradoxes that permeate this work. And going back to page 4, freedom is a form of domination, top of page 3. I'm not sure exactly where Jenny started, but in the totalizing unity that you are talking about, or that you referred to, I think there's another ambiguity in this work where I'm not sure if it's the whole which is determining the part or the part which is determining the whole. Because if you look on page 4, I'm not sure, again, if this is what Jenny had read. The middle of page 4, he describes this condition of constantly increasing productivity and domination of nature, which keeps individuals, or at least the majority of them in the advanced countries, living in increased comfort. So to me, this is saying that a part of the whole is benefiting and is determining what's going on historically. But later on, even just on the bottom of page 4, we get this idea about 4 lines up from the bottom, 5 lines up from the bottom. The whole, from the outset, the whole has asserted itself in the sacrifice of the happiness and the freedom of the greater part. So this is just one point I'm trying to sort of highlight. Is it the part which is determining the whole? That is the advanced countries or the advanced civilizations that are exploiting all of humanity? Or is it somehow this whole that is dominating and determining the part? I'll leave it at that and come back to some other things here, what people want to continue with.
Yeah, great questions, Mark. Yeah, I think you're getting with this, and also the earlier discussion, we're really getting to some of the heart of these. I mean, I think the heart of Marcuse's work, he's a dialectical thinker, right, in the tradition of Hegel and Marx. So contradiction is really the stuff of his philosophy, right? And he identifies a number of them here. And I think this whole versus part is really interesting and really key. You know, my sense is, personally, I don't think I have a full answer, but my sense is that he thinks in the late capitalism, right, which I think we're living in that even more so these days. The whole has become increasingly dominant over the part. You know, so he has this discussion of the way the ego, the individual consciousness has shrunk, is increasingly shrinking. There's less and less kind of internal space for spontaneity, for freedom, for autonomy. The individual tends to be just kind of sublimated into the whole, you know, the collective, the apparatus. And I think in many ways here this is a kind of consequence of Hegelian, the Hegelian sublimation, we could say, the Hegelian sublation, this is often called. I think the way he uses sublimation here may actually be a very similar process, what Hegel describes. So that will be my take on this, but definitely a lot of food for discussion here. So thanks for bringing these up, and you know, keeping this in mind, and also the previous issues. Let me move down the list here of hands. See, Audrey hasn't spoken yet. Audrey, why don't you take a turn?
Well, I don't really know if you want me to, because I have to say I had such a hard time with this. I agree with Barbara. I think the writing and the debate style of his writing is definitely persuasive. I thought it was actually done so well that it kept me reading, but I was from the beginning to the end, getting more and more pissed off. I've never read a paper that really upset me as much as this one, and I was trying to figure out why. And it had to do with the fact that when he's talking about the apparatus, I'm saying to myself, this whole thing is an apparatus. This whole thing with Freud became this poisonous apparatus, from my point of view, as well as, you know, the whole idea of the proletariat. And I mean, I've always thought of myself as a Marxist socialist, but it was like another apparatus. And he's taking these two giant apparatuses, and he just left out Christianity. It's just like, if you put it all together, everything we're doing is within these three things. And I found myself being totally so oppressed that how do you get out of it? Because it's not just capitalism at this point. It's, you know, it's the way we view ourselves in capitalism. And it comes back to the paper that we read on ambiguity. I mean, this is all about ambiguity. It's that we as human beings are so ambiguous and there are so many things that we could go for and do, and we end up being swallowed in these apparatusi. How do you say that? And we can't seem to I apologize for, I'm still in my nightgown, but anyway, so I'm just saying that it was just, it's a way of being, and now it's a way of describing ourselves. So if we're stuck in this, and we're also trying to come out of it, if we're constantly describing it through these apparatuses that are stifling us, yes, of course, you're always going to find the cracks of some pleasure, and you're going to find some gratification, and that seems to keep us going, but it's less and less, and we're still keeping going. And it's, I don't know, I just found it like I wanted him to just shut up, you know. And if we talked about the pleasure principle one more time, or the libido, I wanted to like run into the paper and strangle him, which is my own kind of, like, you know, like, where does this anger come from? So anyway, I'm gonna have my coffee now.
No, he does
What?
say, well, he does say that the more advanced civilization becomes, the more aggression it releases. You know, there is this strange counterintuitive principle, right? That as we have more and can make more and produce more and consume more, we actually become more repressed.
Right, but you're still talking about it within the apparatus. You're still describing it using the terms of exactly the apparatuses that are, and the language of such, makes you think in those languages, makes you think of those terms. Like the term ego to me makes my skin crawl. So well, you called on me, so.
Audrey, I'm just curious. I'm very intrigued by your response. Is it that he's psychologizing stuff that should be more social structural? Is that?
I don't know. What I'm saying is, I can't say that, because he's writing. He has, you know, exactly what James Cook was saying. He goes from someplace. He starts his argument. He gets to it. He makes his case. He's damn persuasive, and that's what frightened me almost. And so it's that he.
You mean it's because his vision is so depressing? It's so total.
It's total, and he didn't get out of it. He's using the same apparatuses that he's actually fighting against, or trying to illuminate us to, but not to get out of it, but to keep using those terms. So I don't see how we're getting out of it if we, you know, those terms are just too embedded now, and I would want to spit them out.
I mean, it's interesting. You know, I just want to say briefly. I mean, just one of the differences between this essay, I think, and Eros and Civilization is that in Eros and Civilization, he does have he talks a lot about polymorphous perversity, and I'll you know, talk about that a little. But he does have a vision, a utopian vision that he tries to articulate in Eros and Civilization that he's not doing here. Like it's, you know, so it is. He never gets to like, okay, what do we do about this, or what's the vision of the liberated society, etc. So, you know, maybe this is an early formulation where he's just trying to get to that. I don't know.
Well, he could, the ambiguity is what is the way to get through this, I think. I wouldn't know how to do it at this point, especially just right now talking, but somehow ambiguity is a very important concept right now. And that's what this makes me think of. Like, we have to somehow embrace that and and then look at his argument from a different, I don't know, I don't want to say outside of it, because we're all in it. So I don't want to be flippant about this either, and just say, oh, I hate Freud. I mean, yes, Freud was the first one that started me, like my skin I had to scratch on my arms. But I really have a hard time with that. But we swallowed it. We all swallowed it as human beings, at least in the Western human beings. So, and it's infected us all, and the way we look at ourselves, and the way we actually say, oh yeah, of course, because our ego is like this, or I mean, thank God I have my super ego, that kind. It's just, and by constantly using the terms, it's like, it's the same way I feel when somebody says to me, oh, but God has a plan. I mean, I want to like lunge someplace. So it's.
But I appreciate, Audrey. I mean, you're bringing us in part. One of the things you're pointing out is this kind of the distinction between an optimism maybe and a pessimism, to be very simplistic about it. But is there a liberating vision here or not? And I think and Todd also mentions we don't get a lot of that in this essay. It's true, and it's interesting. This was written actually a year after Eros and Civilization. But apparently, from the little introduction, it was kind of an occasional piece. It was written for a conference on the 100th anniversary of Freud's birth. And so, I guess he only had so much space and time to use here. But, one thing to mention is Freud himself was actually quite pessimistic, and Marcuse points this out, right? Freud makes this forceful argument: civilization is based on repression. The more civilized we become, the more we advance, we progress, we grow our productive powers, the more we're actually repressing the instinctual nature, which is really where happiness, in a certain sense, really where we derive happiness. So there is this conflict right in the heart of civilization, and Freud was pessimistic about it. He didn't think there was any solution. And Marcuse actually takes Freud to task about that, right? And he says, actually, there's reason to be optimistic, because we can come up with a vision of a liberated society. And that's in part how Marcuse became so influential. He was really influential in the 60s, also really controversial. I think a lot of kind of more conservative forces turned against him. He was teaching at University of California, San Diego, I think. And administration was against him, and various groups were criticizing him. So it was but he does have this vision, which doesn't really come out in this paper very much. And I was actually curious if, Todd, you could say a little bit about that, if you don't mind, to kind of put some of that on the table. And we can maybe follow some of the passages here too that are, we do get some hints in this essay, but if you can speak to that, that would be great.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I don't want to, I'm hesitant to jump ahead of Barbara because she's been patiently waiting. She only had a brief remark earlier.
Oh, Alex, you got to flip a coin.
Well, I mean,
Barbara, why don't you go? Because actually, I do want to talk about that, and I want to talk about that in the context of civilization and its discontents and a couple other things. So I will.
Okay.
I'll address that. But go ahead, Barbara.
This will be short then. Just to answer Audrey a little bit, the way she's describing using language, it sounds to me like we're entrapped because we don't have any other language besides the language of domination. But that's kind of a Whorfian position where your external reality totally determines your language, and then you can't express anything but that. And that's kind of a discredited position. So no worries there, I think. There are always cracks in that formidable structure. But the only comment I wanted to make goes back to the word that we looked at initially, which was apparatus. And I thought to myself, the word choice here is so interesting throughout. But when he talks about apparatus, people have been pointing out that there are goals of this. But if you just take the word itself, it's like the thingiest thing you can think of. So if we're designed to just internalize what's external and then trap ourselves with it or perpetuate it, then basically when we internalize that apparatus, we become robots. We become things. That's the implication. And I guess it depends, and this is my question, on how deterministic this is. How I think Freud had a pretty heavy duty determinism going, but I'm not sure about Marcuse. I don't know that much about him. So I'd be interested to know again how much he was deterministic, because the other question I had was from last week about how people were complaining about Sartre and saying that he was idealistic. But honestly, if we've internalized our policeman or our apparatus, then making choices at all becomes almost a miracle. It's not just idealism, it's miraculous that we can do anything at all, and maybe we can't. That seems to take it to an extreme, and I'd like to know whether I've gone off a cliff and there's any wiggle room in Marcuse's vision. That's all.
Say a couple of things. I think you're bringing us to a really crucial question of, where does liberation come from? How is it possible? Suppose we are in this state of domination by cultural, political, economic apparatus, and we've actually internalized so much of it. Marcuse calls that superego after Freud. Where does freedom come from? And I think this is one place to see a difference, like a pretty clear difference between Freud or Marcuse, let's say here, and Sartre. Because Sartre has this view that we are always already free. Even if we're thrown into our freedom, we're condemned to be free. And no matter what oppressive situation I find myself, how much superego I've internalized, the freedom in a kind of ontological sense is always there. And Marcuse rejects that. He throws that right out the window. He classes Sartre with all these ontological theorists who are essentially idealists for him. And so the question, I think, becomes more difficult than for Marcuse. Right? Like, where does freedom come from? Where does liberation come from? And I think that's where he would want to point to the libido and these basic fundamental instincts that are always striving to shake off repression, and then that leads into a kind of a whole logic of what this liberation looks like, how the dynamic of struggling against the domination, and so much of the essay is really trying to articulate that dynamic, I think. But yeah, and I think there's room here also for the existentialist, for Sartre, to argue back against Marcuse and to ask, wait a minute, is Marcuse really giving us enough for liberation? Or isn't something else necessary? And we saw some of that in Sartre's essays, the ontology of freedom, a kind of Cartesian, quasi-Cartesian sense or power maybe of freedom. Isn't that something necessary here? And I think Sartre would argue yes. But yeah, I think it's a really fruitful kind of debate that this has opened up. And okay, so well, I mean, looking at the hands, Todd, if you wanted to jump in, James, also, you've had your hand up for a while, actually. James, if you want to, James K, if you want to make a comment, and
Thanks, Alex.
and then get to Todd afterwards.
Yeah, I think he's really, his writing is really, saving my thinking about Hegel, Marx, Hegel, and Nietzsche. So he's, when he brings in Freud, he's arguing in the, in the line of Nietzsche, right? The Dionysian, and then Bergson, the vital impulse. So to me, that's what Eros is. So he's bringing the Eros, and then he's lining it up with Marx and Hegelian rationalism. So that's really interesting that I'm trying to tie those together. So he's arguing, against this kind of idealistic form of freedom that he accuses Sartre of having, and he also mentions Kant too, that kind of freedom where it's depends on the kind of idea of universal ethics, that is what he calls a suppression, right? Repression. So you have to repress yourself and identify with this universal ethics, which is kind of like a superego. So that's what I'm seeing. Anyway, on page 18, if we could read something about the mass and the whole, there's something there that if you could, I'd like to talk about. This right here. That
Yeah, you want to, which exact paragraph do you have in mind?
Yeah, this one right here, this one right here, thus the masses.
Yeah, if you want to read it, go right ahead.
Yeah, it says, thus the masses are no longer simply those who are dominated, but rather the governed who are no longer in opposition, or whose opposition itself is integrated into the positive whole as a calculable and manipulative corrective that demands improvements in the apparatus. What was previously a political subject has become an object, and the antagonistic interests that were previously irreconcilable seem to have passed over into a true collective interest. So I guess he's saying that the masses are kind of like, integrated, into this mass, into this whole, right? The totality of the collective. And that is that's his point, isn't it? That the individuality, the idea of freedom is lost, in this collective, in this mass. And later on page 23, he mentions how the masses are, talking about domination. The domination, he argues, begins with the primal father, the primal, the master signifier. That's a Lacanian term, I guess. But on page 23, is this right here? Yeah.
Should be 23 here, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think he says that. Yeah, he's talking about here okay. He says that the development of the instincts into the path. But yeah, the primal father is the, okay. Oh, I lost it now. Okay.
Are you looking at the screen here? Because I'm not sure where you're.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, right here. Yeah,
Okay.
Freud actually did that. But he says that the despotism of the primal father that forces the developments of the instincts into the path, which then becomes the psychological foundation for rational domination-based civilization, which, however, never abandoned its roots in the original domination. Since the rebellion of sons, the brothers against the primal father, and the reestablishment and internalization of paternal authority, domination, religion, and morality have been intimately connected, and in such a way that the latter provide the psychological foundation for the permanence and the legitimized organization, the reason, of was it colonization?
Could be domination. I'm
Is it domination? Oh yeah,
not
domination.
sure, but probably
Yeah, I
domination.
think it's domination. But at
Yeah.
the same time, makes domination universal. Yeah, it is. Yeah, but this is what I wanted to point out, that the domination begins with the primal father. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
this is where is that? That's from, is it Totem and Taboo? Was that the Freud's work where he gives this myth of the primal horde? Do you know more about this, James, by any chance?
I think that's really what he refers to, the Oedipal complex, right? And the Oedipal complex is what Deleuze points out as the complex that Freud introduces that conforms to what society demands. So actually, Deleuze is critiquing Freud as a kind of conformist to the to this kind of domination, because he's treating people with a problem, and then they come in, and he tells them, well, you're and he's treating them in terms of the structure of domination, and so the cure is to kind of just go along with the program of being Oedipalized and being dominated, and do your perform your role. So that's a critique there, and so he there's a little bit of this is a little bit of a critique here, because this is actually what Freud is saying. But Freud has this he still has this ambiguity, right, between civilization and discontent. So there's always this kind of tension there, and it's never resolved. But he doesn't critique this notion of the Oedipal complex. That's just kind of it's a given.
Yeah, and it's interesting with Freud. I mean, he has he was such a prolific writer and so influential, and he had his clinical writings, but then he had this other group of writings. Marcuse calls them meta psychological or even philosophical writings. And I think this one here that's referred to, this myth of the primal father, I think it was one of them. It's Totem and Taboo where this comes up. And Freud thought, he gave this kind of hypothetical myth of what must have happened in very early primal societies, so that, I think he was asking, where does the feeling of guilt originate? And he has the story of there being a primal tyrannical father who possessed all the pleasure, and of course that meant possessing all the women. And then his sons, they band together and they kill him, depose him, and then they institute society, something more, not exactly egalitarian, but something less tyrannical. That I take it as I haven't really looked into this very much, but I think that's the basic argument there. And one of Freud's ideas here is that civilization arises out of domination, repression. That at the root, it's not a kind of happy, contract that somehow these noble savages enter into. No, at the root there is tyranny, there is power, there is threat and anxiety, and Freud, I think, was very big on that side of the human experience. And Marcuse, I think, has some ambiguity about that, because I think he agrees with Freud, but he also wants to move beyond Freud. And that's where I think this essay becomes really interesting.
Well, this is where the guilt that he talks about comes from, right? That they share this guilt of rebellion against the father. At the same time, it's something that needs to be done, but it's
Yeah, and I think part of the question for Marcuse is this guilt necessary for civilization? If it is, then we seem to be left with a pretty pessimistic view, like Freud did. But Marcuse, I think, wants to say the guilt is actually historically determined. It's not necessary, it doesn't have to be there, especially as society has progressed. We can move beyond guilt, I think. I think he wants to argue at the end of the day. Um, yeah, so I mean, Todd, you're up in the queue if you want to comment on this or anything else.
Sure. Yeah. No, I think you guys are totally, hitting the nails on the head here about this stuff. Uh, I I mean, one really striking thing to me about this essay is that it's like 90% of it is in civilization and its discontents. It really is so much Freud. And the whole setup of the paradox here is very Freudian. I mean, in a way, really, the only piece of this that goes beyond Freud is this idea that, okay, maybe we can reverse this, in increasing level of civilization plus guilt when we get to a level of basically surplus, right? When he talks about we build our wealth, and at some point maybe we don't need to do that anymore. Maybe we can now think about what gives humans joy and pleasure. But it's so Freudian. And I think James, that first passage that you read us, it really anticipates Foucault, right? This idea that what begins as kind of a resistance to domination, that the domination itself gets baked into what he calls the apparatus. I mean, when I see apparatus here in this text, I just think social structure, right? That social structure itself, bureaucracy, increasingly complex forms of economic and productive and social organization, all that stuff. This idea somehow that we swallow our chains. We come to swallow our chains, right? That domination itself it really becomes baked into the social structure. But just to back up for a second and remind us what the really basic Freudian idea here is, and I hope I'm not vulgarizing. This probably reflects my own vulgar recollection of reading Civilization's Discontents. But the idea here, of course, is that we begin life as what Freud literally calls polymorphous. We're polymorphously perverse as infants. That is, we don't have explicit sites of erogenous zones, or I mean, and this is also erogenous and eros is writ large. It's not just sexual for Freud, right? It's it's any form of pleasure. But we come into the world experiencing all sensation, as pleasure, all activity is pleasure. I mean, this idea that work can be pleasurable is, I think, harkens back to this idea. I mean, it's actually an Aristotelian idea that the exercise of our faculties, the ability to do things in the world, and to test the limits of our capacities, is itself pleasurable, right? So we have this kind of halcyon Edenic state of polymorphous perversity, and then we of course are kind of happy in our family. We wouldn't necessarily want to leave our family, but it is the kind of combination of the incest taboo and the Oedipus complex that drives us out of the family, right? The resolution of the Oedipus complex is, more generally, it's the message that we can't stay in our family, we can't stay infants and in our family forever. We have to go out into the world, to go from, family of origin to family of procreation. We have to go out into the world and, find our own families and also transform our infantile, instincts into, we have to repress and sublimate them so that we can actually build civilization, right? So that we can defer gratification, engage in work in the world, et cetera, et cetera. Like all of the work we do, all of the stuff we do as adults requires that repression, requires us to kind of grow up, leave the family, defer our gratification, try to transform the world both individually and collectively in these, productive actions, and et cetera, so that civilization goes with repression for Freud, right, and obviously for Marcuse. And the paradox here is that, if we're truly committed to progressing civilization and building, the ability of society to, control the world and, make more goods and, meet human needs and all that stuff, we have to engage in repression, right? The more sophisticated society becomes, the more sophisticated we want society to become, the more productive we want society to become, the more we have to defer gratification, engage in labor, that's more and more complicated, that's more and more sophisticated, et cetera, et cetera. So that I think is the paradox he's faced with, right? We accept and Freud indeed fully accepted this idea that we had to sublimate, right? That sublimation here is the transformation of our desire from, kind of simple desires we experience early in life to, sophisticated projects to create, productive capacity in the world, to create art, to create literature, et cetera, et cetera. All of that stuff is, very distant from our original instinctual, form of organization, right? So Marcuse basically is saying, okay, we have this, we're faced with this paradox. We're getting to a point in society where we don't have to all, work our asses off. Maybe we actually are able to produce surplus and meet human needs and minimize, what at some point he calls the realm of necessity somewhere else, and, really kind of, go back to, thinking about, okay, let's experience joy. Let's experience human joy again. But yeah, for Freud, I think this was an unresolved paradox, right? Because the highest achievements in human civilization were only achieved by this continuing repression of more basic instincts. But I've got to say, I'm also totally with Audrey's response to this, because, it's so Freudian, and it's so like, I think of this as like the hydraulic conception of the self. You have these flows of instincts that meeting barriers, and they have to either, turn back or flow around the barrier or be transformed by, these sublimation into these higher forms of human achievement and all this stuff. But it's very, very hydraulic. There's no social learning conception of the self here. Yeah. But I think, and also Mark said earlier on, freedom is a form of domination. He pointed us to that essential quote: freedom is as a form of domination, and that's, that comes up again and again in this text, right? We only achieve freedom through unfreedom, he says, which, and again, I think what he means, I'm not sure, but I think what he means there is we can only achieve, kind of the heights of civilization and increase our degrees of freedom, both socially and individually, by a form of unfreedom, by this repression that we have to do to transform our more fundamental instincts.
So do you think that if there's a ethics, or is it a kind of a hedonism? I mean, do we live for pleasure? Is that the ultimate goal?
I mean, I'm trying to remember. It's been so long since I read Eros and Civilization, where he does talk a lot about. He does finally talk, I think, about, and if other people know this better, please chime in. But I think he does actually return to talking about. He uses the phrase again and again, polymorphous perversity. We return to his kind of polymorphous, perverse form of erotic organization, where we experience joy through the exercise of all of our sensations, all of our faculties, etc. He doesn't explicitly, like, it's a little odd, right? Because it's very hard to read this Freudian stuff without thinking all the time about sex. Like, is he really talking about what is he talking about? Are we supposed to sleep with everyone? I mean, it's not clear. But so that's left ambiguous. But it is this sense of, there is this sense of kind of a return to a free, pleasure-based kind of set of activities. But he doesn't go into it hugely, but he does point us back to this idea of, an earlier form of erotic organization.
But if he also mentions the pleasure of work, so it is, maybe it's in line with Deleuze's idea of productive desire, that there is this kind of eros is not just polymorphous perverse, but it's a kind of polymorphous perverse in the enjoyment of exercising one's total capacities intellectually and artistically and so forth.
Yeah, good point.
On that, yeah, great points. Thanks, Todd, for your comments. And I think, I mean, in a way, you were talking about this interaction between the pleasure and the reality principles, right? And the way the reality principle becomes so oppressive. I think Freud saw that as well as Marcuse, but then they differ on, I do think there is an ethics here. If that's the right word, but there's certainly a kind of a vision that I think he has. And I do want to, before moving on, if Felipe and Chris have their hands up, I do want to get us to a couple of passages here. What he does give us in this paper, which is not a lot, on his positive vision of what is this liberated society? What is it going to look like, feel like? What kind of experience are we going to have there? I think in Eros and Civilization, he even goes so far as to talk about a kind of libidinal rationality. Rationality that's no longer the repressive dominant kind, but that really has as its focus the freeing of instinctual energy and using it for joy and satisfaction. Let me read a little bit here. This is on the bottom of 5 in the PDF and stretching over into 6. So he brings this notion of a potential. And I think this is also tied to, it's a kind of potential for liberation, I think. And he says to compare potential freedom with existing freedom, to see the latter in the light of the former presupposes that at the present stage of civilization, much of the toil, renunciation, and regulation imposed upon men is no longer justified by scarcity, the struggle for existence, poverty, and weakness. I think, Todd, exactly as you were saying, society could afford a high degree of instinctual liberation without losing what it has accomplished or putting a stop to its progress. The basic trend of such liberation, as indicated by Freudian theory, would be the recovery of a large part of the instinctual energy diverted to alienated labor and its release for the fulfillment of the autonomously developing needs of individuals. That would in fact also be desublimation, but a desublimation that would not destroy the spiritualized manifestations of human energy, but rather take them as projects for and possibilities of happy satisfaction. To me, this sounds like, things like literature, the arts, science as well. The result would be not a reversion to the prehistory of civilization, but rather a fundamental change in the content and goal of civilization, in the principle of progress. I shall try to explain this elsewhere, so he has another essay on this. Here, I should simply like to point out that the realization of this possibility presupposes fundamentally changed social and cultural institutions. In the existing culture, that progression appears as a catastrophe, and the battle against it as a necessity, with the result that the forces tending toward it are paralyzed. I think he means here the reactionary tendency in the existing culture. And another shorter passage on 25, actually bottom of 24, spilling into 25. really right along the same lines. At this stage of development, unfreedom appears no longer as the fundamental condition of rational freedom, but rather as a limitation on freedom. The achievements of domination-based civilization have undermined the necessity of unfreedom. The degree of domination of nature and of social wealth attained makes it possible to reduce ungratifying labor to a minimum. Quantity is transformed into quality. Free time can become the content of life, and work can become the free play of human capacities. I think, James, you were pointing to this earlier. In this way, the repressive structure of the instincts would be explosively transformed. The instinctual energies that would no longer be caught up in ungratifying work would become free, and as Eros would strive to universalize libidinous relationships and develop a libidinous civilization. And I think this really is a key word here, this libidinous civilization. So no longer based on work and performance, but based on something else, which is hard to articulate exactly. And Todd, you were raising some issues around, what exactly is that going to mean? Is that going to be like the free love of the 60s? Is that what we mean? That seemed to fizzle out. So yeah, I think here we could also raise critical questions about Marcuse. Is it really possible to keep as he wants to the benefits, the fruits of civilization without keeping its repression as well? If we do away with repression, are we not going to basically regress? Are we not going to fall into a kind of dark age very quickly? This is something that I've been wondering. But I wanted to put these two passages on the table because, it's as much as we get here of his vision for what is a liberated society. And I think it's more than Freud says. I think Freud only intimates this in his writings. But with that, let's turn to Felipe and then Chris after that.
Well, I just want to interject, Alex, if I may. It's also, there's something that I actually underlined both sections that you read. And I also found another one, because I was looking for that, on page 27 on the top, where if instinctual repression can be done away with to the point where the existing relationship of labor and enjoyment can be reversed, the archaic sublimation of erotic energy can be revoked. If therefore sensuousness and reason, happiness and freedom can be brought into harmony or even unity, this is possible only at the height of the development of civilization, where the state of absolute need and lack could be done away with, technically at least, which at least he put that in, because technically I could see that, surely. And where the struggle for existence no longer needs to be a struggle for the means of existence. I mean, I think that's exactly, that's where Marx was going, and I think that it's a beautiful idea. And anyway, so I'm not going to interrupt, but I just wanted to show that there's someplace else that he talks about where, his vision, and I do have a view of how to get there, but I'll wait for my turn. Thanks.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, Audrey. Yeah, and I would say this is where idealists will come in strongly with their criticisms. And I was kind of alluding to that earlier. People like in our day, people like Jordan Peterson has been a strong voice in this direction. Roger Scruton, another one, and others like them, who would say, well, if you do away with self-discipline, if you do away with this internal repression that we all do to remain civilized, then we're just going to be back into barbarism. And this is a kind of pipe dream that Marcuse has here. So I think, something we can keep in mind and Sartre might also say something like this, maybe a little more measured, a little more qualified. But for Sartre too, if we do away with negation, with transcending what is currently given for a project, for a future, then we kind of fall into facticity, we become things. So a couple of criticisms to keep in mind there. And Felipe, why don't you take it away, and then Chris is next in the queue.
Yes, okay. I just want to comment that in this essay shows that Marcuse is heavily influenced by Marx's theory of alienation. That it is exposed basically in the Paris manuscripts, which were published until 1932. So all the Russian Revolution and all the previous Marxists before this time did not have access to this unpublished text that Marx brought in 1844, which are called the Paris manuscripts, in which he elaborates a little bit about his concept of the theory of alienation and of alienated labor. So Marcuse here is obviously heavily influenced by the Marx theory of alienation, in which Marx, in previous texts, for example, which were already published, for example, the Critique to the Philosophy of Right of Hegel, and others, shows that he agrees, Marx, that is, Marx in turn was heavily influenced by Feuerbach and the book, Feuerbach book, The Essence of Christianity, in which Feuerbach shows that Christian religious consciousness actually shows an alienated, it is an alienated consciousness, this kind of religious consciousness, or in Freudian terms, this superego, this religious Christian superego, will be the product of an alienated mind. Now, if you are obviously, if you are alienated, you have an alienated consciousness, you cannot be free, because these alienations suggest that you are divided of something essentially that belongs to yourself. So that is that you are separated from something that it is essential. So it is impossible to be free while you are alienated. And so in that, that's why I think the Marcuse says that freedom is a form of domination. That is when a person acts and he thinks that this person thinks that he's acting freely, that he is doing an act of freedom. He actually is, he maybe is not conscious of that he's alienated, that he's acting according to superego that was with the course of what Althusser calls the ideological state apparatus, like family, church, etc. This superego was, it is influenced by the ruling ideology, which is the ideology of the ruling class. And so Feuerbach says that this Christian consciousness is unhealthy because it projects in a being that does not exist what really should belong to that is qualities that actually belong to man, to mankind, and these qualities are projected into a being that actually it does not exist, that it is a fantasy. So it is an alienated man because it projects what should belong to man into this fictional or entity, which is God. So Feuerbach concludes that this religion, this religious consciousness, or in Freudian terms, religious superego, is unhealthy because it clearly shows an alienated man, so alienated mind. So Feuerbach recommends getting rid of religion. Marx agrees with Feuerbach, but Marx sees the root of this alienation, the root cause of this alienation in the alienated level, what Marx expounds in the Paris manuscripts, which is the alienated labor. So Marx says you can show that religious consciousness is a form of alienation or form of mind alienation, but if you don't go to solve the root cause, which is material alienation, even if you get rid of religion, at the end you will have another form of alienated consciousness, because Marx sees the root of the alienation in the material reality, in the society. So that's why Marcuse says, in order to be free, you need to go outside to the material world and change society, because it is not enough to just being consciousness that we are in certain form alienated if we don't solve the material alienation.
Yeah, let me jump in with a question. This is interesting because you're bringing us to the Marxian, theory and this distinction between the material versus the superstructure, right? And it's interesting. I'm curious what you think about the way Marcuse is kind of expanding that, right? He thinks so. I think he accepts the Marxist theory pretty clearly, but he wants to supplement it, right? And he is adding. It's as if it's a whole other dimension, borrowing from Freud, of the base, and he seems to be saying, look, the base is not only material in the sense of the technology we have or the methods that we have for transforming the world, for building, new machines or devices or what have you. There is also an instinctual aspect to the base of the economy of social life. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts on that, like how this whole instinctual discussion, of the drives, eros and thanatos, pleasure, principle, libido, etc., how that fits with the Marxist analysis. I'm curious if you have, or anybody else, any thoughts on that. That will be, I think, really interesting to touch on.
Well, for Marx, isn't labor of alienated labor a form of repression, right? So it's not the labor that is that is repressed labor is not enjoying the fruits of his labor or her labor, but it's based on very basic need, or just almost forced labor. And so it is in the act of that kind of labor, it's a form of repression, a denial of the pleasure principle.
Well, Alex, I think you're absolutely right, though. I mean, this is really the Frankfurt School project is trying to understand, why didn't communist revolution happen in the Western European and democracies and in the U.S. And it's this extension of, it's examining how it was that capitalism was so resilient at preserving itself. And their early main tome was this book, The Authoritarian Personality, in which they kind of, they write capitalist domination small in terms of the family as, a way of transmitting, forms of domination. And so, yeah, I mean, all these guys are, I think, very interested in this question of what's going on psychologically in terms of our psychological development and, our social development that enables capitalism to persist beyond where, Marx might have thought it might have collapsed.
Yeah, and it's interesting, unlike some of the other Marxists that we read, I mean, Lukács may be a bit of an exception, but Garodi seemed very much, very gung-ho about Stalin and Lenin and so on. And I think Marcuse was really critical of the Soviet Union. He saw the Soviet Union not as this flourishing communism, but as another repressive, he even mentions even more repressive than a democracy, than Western democracies, right? Because yeah, and I think, you know, for him, the source of his critique is this libidinal, is this theory of instincts and a kind of psychology that he gets, psychoanalytic psychology, let's say, that he gets from Freud. What's interesting is, I mean, somebody mentioned earlier how there may be a bit of an affinity between Sartre and Marcuse. And I agree with that. I can definitely see that, in the sense that they're both critical of classical Marxism, you know, of the Marxism, especially what Marxism becomes in the hands of communist parties, and, you know, it becomes this kind of scientific, deterministic, materialistic theory. And I think, you know, Sartre and Marcuse, they criticize that, but in very different ways. With Sartre, he brings in this whole dimension of meaning, of the individual opening up a future, you know, kind of ontology of freedom. And for Marcuse, it is the libidinal critique that he brings to the table, you know, and I think hedonism is a good way, a kind of methodological hedonism, is maybe a good way of describing what, you know, his perspective. Hey, Chris, you're up in the queue, and you've been waiting patiently. And a few other hands, I would want to jump down to Leboisa, had his hand up, hasn't spoken yet, and then we can continue with people in queue. But Chris, why don't you take it away?
Hi, yeah, I'm totally new to this group. I just wanted to say this discussion is super fascinating. I'm not as well versed in philosophy as most of you, but what I wanted to do was just ask a question. I know that we're talking about the readings right now, but there were some questions from you, Alex, earlier about the origin of guilt, and that's kind of where there's a lot of psychology ties into a lot of this philosophical thinking, I think. And I just was wondering if this would be the place to kind of put forth another theory from another field, basically, to that isn't part of the reading, but just to like describe where some of like the modern psychology is going with origin of guilt, just to kind of like put a little nest egg in some of your minds, but it's not related to this reading at all. So I was just wondering if I could do that or not.
I would say that would be interesting, sure. And especially if you see any connections with these larger questions that are on the table, like, you know, what a liberated society might look like, or a society where guilt is not so burdensome, the way at least Freud believed it was. But yeah, go for it.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. So talking about the origin of guilt, specifically, there's a theory which is actually it's based on Freud originally, so it comes out of psychoanalytics, and but kind of like the more modern version of psychoanalytics, one could say, might be psychodynamics. So that's looking at kind of more internal processes on a micro scale, and defenses and how we defend ourselves against certain actions of or externalities, basically. And specifically, there is a psychiatrist by the name of Habib Davin-Liu, who is, and there were probably a few, you know, before him, but he kind of like more solidified this theory. And he coined the term intensive short-term dynamic psychotherapy. That was his name for his theory. And it sounds like a super long name, but essentially it's a type of psychodynamics that's very kind of intensely focused on emotional experience. And from that kind of and with the addition of like some traditional behavioral or developmental psychology, he came up with an origin kind of where guilt kind of comes from, and why it's kind of, you can expand that, you can extrapolate that onto why it's so prevalent in society today. And I'm not an expert on psychoanalytics and things like that. So if what I'm saying, if what I'm about to say actually seems to kind of go into a previous theory or from some previous works, I would be really interested if anybody if this kind of makes any sense to people. So the theory goes such that as infants, we're completely helpless to the world, right? Like, so we need and we need to be taken care of, and that's the job of our parents, basically, or our primary caregivers, whoever those might be. And they basically provide us with everything, absolutely everything, from shelter, food, emotional connection or attachment, and all of these things are needed, are a necessity for a human being to survive in those very early years, right? And so because our parents are so instrumental in these very fundamental needs for our literal survival as an infant. I mean, even though we're not kind of conscious of, the way that we survive, we're very instinctual as infants, and we know what we need to survive, and we know what's going to kill us, and we know what's going to keep us alive. And so because the parents or the parental caregivers basically give us all of these things, they end up becoming the oppressors. Okay. And so because parents end up becoming oppressive, insofar as they give us all these things, but they also have rules, right? And they might not always smile when we're crying, right? And so as we get consistent doses of this oppression, we also one of the reasons that we also feel oppressed is because we know that we are so helpless, and because we realize that we are kind of extremely helpless in this situation, that we depend on them for everything. We know that we are not able to kind of lash out. And of course, babies are going to, some of colic babies are going to cry and scream all the time. But we know that we are not able to actually, some of the oppressions that occur to us, we're not able to actually act on those things with anger in any kind of material way that's going to make a difference. And so because of that, we know that we have to, we end up complying, basically. We end up complying and to the needs of our parents throughout our lives. And that creates guilt, basically. That's really the origin of guilt, is that we have this conflicted, very kind of complex relationship with our parents, where our parents actually give us what we need, but we also have this oppression by them, and so this anger towards them. And so when we have anger towards, and even in a lot of cases rageful anger as a baby, because a lot of times, pre-verbal, we are not able to communicate some of our needs, and sometimes our parents just don't know what to do, and sometimes our parents are neglectful. And so that creates an element of anger and rage that kind of sits with us. And so because we have this anger conflicted with the need for someone who is essentially an oppressor, that creates guilt, basically, because we also love this person, and so, but we also have rage against them. And so to suppress that rage, it becomes guilt, basically. Like, we feel guilty for having anger and rage towards someone that we love and we depend on and things like that. And so that is is kind of where the origin of guilt comes from, and we carry that then throughout our lives. And as we carry that throughout our lives, that becomes basically embedded in society, because everybody was an infant at one time and everybody had parental caregivers at one time. And so this conflict of rage towards someone that you love creates that guilt that you say, oh, I don't want to hurt that person, or I don't want to be angry at that person. That is something that basically developed to bind the family together, because you couldn't have infants, raging at their parents all the time. Otherwise, the family would fracture and fall apart. So from an evolutionary point of view, that kind of sticks the family together. But then that pervades society as a whole, basically, and we become trapped with our guilt because we have this program essentially that we've that really was really beneficial to us as an infant. It allowed us to survive, right? It was really a survival mechanism. As adults, it doesn't help us. And so that was something that, I heard a few people struggling with, and it's a theory that, I think makes a lot of sense. And so I just want to kind of like put that out there as a nest egg that people can kind of think about. And I always try to think that, like, we have philosophy, and that is kind of like, to me, like macroeconomics, and then we have psychology, which is kind of like microeconomics, and we need kind of both of them to understand each other, and so this is kind of like a microeconomic view of how some of these things can pervade in society.
Yeah, I think that's a great description of, Marcuse calls it here, Freudian uses the Freudian term of the superego, right? And I think you're describing in really kind of intricate terms, how the superego develops out of this, years long relationship with parental authority figures, right? And then we could say, Freud, I think, argues the process even continues, right? Because when you move out of the family, well, then you have your teachers, and the teachers are going to have their demands and all kinds of ways of, shaping us. And then you have your, employers, and you have, there's always going to be an authority. And then at some point, we even take on the role of authority figures. We become parents ourselves, we become teachers
Exactly.
ourselves, or
Yeah.
employers, or what have you.
Yeah. I totally agree. And I think that we, when we talk about, our teachers are authority figures, or our bosses are authority figures, well, we are, those are just people. Those are human beings, and they went through the same processes as us. And you're right, we are ourselves authority figures to, whether we're a team leader or, a parent or something like that. And it's almost like we don't have a choice to, like, have some, there's always going to be some authority figure, exactly like what you're saying. And we carry these kind of unconscious programs, which are kind of part of that superego construct of what you're saying, throughout our lives. And it really, unless we can kind of like break away from that, if we can kind of realize that, okay, we have these authority figures, but I don't have to necessarily have some of that guilt associated with it. That's how we can kind of, break through that. But that's a bit of another discussion. But I definitely agree with what you're saying, Alex.
Yeah, and interestingly, if we look at Marcuse, I think he takes on exactly what you're describing. He's right on board, I think, with this logic. And I think Freud also describes a lot of this. And Marcuse, what he does, and Jason is giving us some comments in the chat as well on this point, to marry this kind of more micro approach, let's say, with the social analysis coming out of Marxism. And this is where we get Marcuse, this kind of equation of Freud plus Marx, right? And so there's an interesting passage. I do wanted to get to, a number of people are waiting in the queue, but just very quickly, on 16, he speaks to some of what you were saying, Chris, here, when he describes some contemporary changes in psychological changes that kind of writ large in Western society. The first one, he calls it reification and automatization of the ego. And we've talked about this already. Barbara, I think, was raising some of this earlier. And then he says, we also have the strengthening of extrafamilial authority. This is on page 16. And he will say, oddly enough, or maybe predictably enough, the power of the family, the way you're describing it, Chris, is actually waning, according to him. In contemporary, late capitalist society, the father, as let's say the authority figure, actually has much less power. And now it's becoming, the situation is such that, children are becoming socialized a lot earlier, and they're taking on a much stronger kind of collective superego. And the kind of the way station of the family is almost, on the decline or is disappearing. And I wonder if, in our time, with so much, divorce is such a big reality, and single parent homes. I wonder if, I think we're continuing to see what Marcuse is talking about here. So almost a kind of direct. It's like the individual is directly exposed to society a lot earlier. And the superego is so much more a reflection of the collective than, let's say, the father's particular superego, or the parental, that parental mediation just seems to be a lot weaker in our time. And I think there is something to that. So just to throw that out as well in connection, Chris, with the points you're making. And let's, conscious of the time here, actually, we're almost at the 2-hour mark. And of course, we continue the discussion, but I know some people have to leave. So let me just say a couple of, just a note about where we're going next time. So I do want to, get us a little bit deeper into this rabbit hole that we're opening up. I came across a paper by Georges Bataille on critical paper of existentialism. And he does something similar to Marcuse. He gives his criticisms, and then he also presents his own theory. And Bataille is a controversial thinker, also very influential, especially in France in the 60s and beyond. He has this pretty, I want to say, famous theory of general economy. So he is a Marxist in a sense, Marx inspired, also inspired by Freud. And there is a paper by him. It's called let me actually make sure I get this right. I'm just going to open up here the drive. Actually, let me just share this quickly here. So this is just by way of, saying where we're going. So I'm looking at the Google Drive here where all the readings are, and you can find the link to this in the event description on Meetup. So here it is, Bataille, From Existentialism to the Primacy of the Economy. And this is really a review of a number of existentialist works, kind of a book review that he writes. But in the second half of it, he also gives his own theory, which is really interesting, I think, and was also very influential for people like Foucault and Derrida and others in the French school. So another kind of critical view on existentialism is what we get with Georges Bataille. So I'm going to invite us to read this for next time and see what we can make of this, especially this idea of a general theory. A general, I think he calls it a theory of general economy that he has. And so let's see how we do with this. And it's, again, another critique of existentialism. Sartre is mentioned here, along with other existential figures. So I think it's, kind of on a larger plane, what we're seeing here is the decline of existentialism, right? So by the late 50s, early 60s, there were basically new kids on the block. Structuralism was becoming really prominent. And I'm also thinking maybe we can look into that as well going forward. And existentialism was being attacked from all sides basically, and it was gradually, it just lost its popularity. It wasn't fashionable anymore. And people like Levi Strauss and Michel Foucault, they came on the scene and they kind of took over. And Sartre fell into a bit of a little bit into their shadow. He wasn't so much in the public eye anymore. I don't think. So something I think worth exploring, since we're looking at this movement. So with that, I'm gonna put that. And so the next step would be, after that, there is this final kind of a defense, one of the late defense by Sartre, Marxism and existentialism, where he will be, this is written about 10 years later, late 50s, 10 years after the earlier Sartre that we were reading. And here he really has transformed his view. So, so I'm going to say, let's sneak Bataille here in August 12th. And August 19th, let's return to Sartre with his Marxism and existentialism. And that's already posted on the in the Google Drive. So that's the plan for next time. Hopefully people will find that interesting. And yeah, let's get back to a discussion now. We've got a few hands that are up. James, I do want to give priority to John. John, you spoke very briefly earlier, and if you want to make a comment or raise any questions, please go for it, and then we can continue down the list.
Sure. I remember a quote from this essay. It said, "Sublimation is a type of repression," and I think that's kind of like been a common theme that I've noticed throughout our talk, in that like we're kind of concentrating on what he said about like how to sublimate your eros, and how to apply it to building more productive society, where that's not really what I got out of this essay. I kind of took it to mean more like, society's repression causing you to have these repressions, and that kind of is bad, so something should be done about it. I take more of a direct approach to it, and I think that, and I'd also like to try to take this work to mean kind of like, yeah, we should be able to sublimate our desires into productive means as well, because that's my natural inclination. And I think that's my natural inclination because of this apparatus. And I think that is mostly everybody's here's natural inclination, trying to find a productive means of kind of almost everything you do and every drive that you have. Yeah, and so I would just like to say that.
Interesting. And I wonder, John, how would you respond to Marcuse, who would say, this is kind of part of this ethic, right, that he's criticizing, and that while we can in this way be very productive, generate, produce, advance, have progress, whether at an individual level or societal level, that at the same time, this is depriving us from happiness in a very real sense. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
No, I would agree with him 100%. I think that's what he is saying. And I was just commenting on our discussion today as an example of how embedded that apparatus is on the micro level, internalized by each of us as individuals. I'm agreeing with what you just said, that yes, this repression is causing us to have problems. But I think, just like, for example, we like dug through the text to find one quote in it that said like work can be sublimated into some kind of higher kind of passion or something like that. And that was like maybe one sentence that somebody pointed out. Whereas the gist of what I got out of the text was exactly what you just said.
Gotcha. Yeah. Okay. Okay, great. Neboisa, did you want to comment as well? You haven't spoken yet. That's why I'm turning.
Thank you, Alex. I didn't want to speak because I didn't read the entire text. I was lazy to read it. It wasn't challenging to me at all. But I posted two possibly productive contributions. One is because we like discussion goes, I think, without the important frame. What was the Frankfurt School about? And what Marcuse is trying to explain? He's trying to explain the authoritarian personality, as you mentioned, Alex, or who mentioned it. So the entire science, to say, is organized about the question how it was possible for fascism not only to develop, because it's always there, from, I don't know, Louis Napoleon onwards, but how it was capable to take over the state, but not just any state, but Germany, the most, let's say, the most cultivated or like the most developed state at few points, important points in European history. So since from the beginning, it is financed by the newest, latest empire, in fact, by CIA. Frankfurt School is the product of CIA in ideological war against Soviet Union, and it develops this specific anti-Soviet communism, which exists nowhere. And then there is Marx, to try to find some foundation for this, this is theoretical hot air, truisms and hot air. I don't say that it is not quality hot air. It is very quality. It is good. I mean, it is good student work, how to say, like retelling, all the combining, experimenting and all that. But the main topic is not there. How capitalism can exist without fascism? That is the real question. And like Red Scare 2, this is the scientific branch of the Red Scare 2, with a very sophisticated and very quality production. And their conclusion somehow also is not present in this text, at least in its first half, I think, that I managed to read. The authoritarian personality is the result of subordination of individuals in production processes. So not in some abstract society with anthropological and psychological, like theoretical complexities, in production. So in order to survive, people have to undergo the authority. So this is what Vivek Chiber is explaining, removing, I hope, once forever, this psychologization, and like people are interpolated into ideology. This is why they don't raise up. I mean, how to raise up? You will not have to pay a rent next month, in most of the capitalist world. And in the end, also I posted Maurice Gaudier, who developed this theory of Bayesian superstructure. And then we come to Jordan Peterson. In fact, Alex, you inspired me to react. I posted great critic by ContraPoints of Jordan Peterson. You will have great fun watching. But what she explains, or he or they explain that Jordan Peterson is a father, lost father for so many white male young people that cannot reproduce the social chains, career chains of their parents. So they search for alternative authority, and this is what Jordan Peterson is giving them. But he is possible because there is no analysis, no proper theory about how it is possible that so developed, so advanced, progressive system still lingers on a division of labor that was characteristic for ancient Egypt. If you just analyze how the construction business is organized, there's no difference in division labor, technical or societal division labor between building of pyramids and building of some new building. So it's some sort of super technologized barbarism, and what this theory is enabling us is it enables us to be structurally blind for these problems. And then when it is about Marx's contribution, I would go for his letter to Chartist celebration of there was some anniversary of Chartist movement, and he wrote a great letter, hoping at that time that English working class, as the most developed working class with the most obvious conflict with the bourgeoisie, will be at the forefront of the world revolution. He finished that letter with, "You conquered the nature." So capitalism prevailed. It organized production so that nature is conquered. It cannot resist anymore the forces of production. Now your mission is to conquer a man. So not to abstractly liberate it, to conquer a man. To conquer it, to take it over from capitalist organization of labor. This is how he ends that letter, and we know what happened. In fact, the most developed working classes of the West understood it in their own way. They decided to conquer the men, but of colonies, you know. that was the result. And it is not a critique or something. Everybody would you know, I don't think that there is so strongly organized working class that would resist this like challenge to live on some other's expense. You know, it's totally normal. Everybody would do it. So it's not about that. Though also the reparations are now becoming the topic, as I can see, media space in the United States, not in the United States, globally. But then we have to think why this leftist and seemingly Marxist theory is anti-Soviet. It is anti-Soviet because, I'm sorry, there is a production at that time that next to all repression and all criminal and all atrocities still manages to reproduce itself in another understanding of both goal of social production and chances of individuals to you know, acquire better position, if not to overcome the division of labor, especially global division of labor, in which the most sophisticated and the less labor intensive jobs are reserved for the classes of the historical core of capitalism, etc. So I think that, I mean, this theory had its time, its purpose, it's interesting, but like it's censored, it's self-censorship. I'm sorry to say, you know, I understand, you know, we are all self-censored in this or another way, but like for such a capacity that Marcuse for sure was, and then he goes later into this new movement, all this trauma of today's left, like why everybody is like in the identity politics, why we cannot cope with the working class that became some sort of reactionary a reservoir for worse political movements. This is all like Marcuse's concepts from 70s, and we can also recognize it, which doesn't mean that this is something he's something like bad theoretician or like whatever. It's its time. He's refugee from Germany, coming from United States. I think that any European intellectual coming to United States would be shocked with the severity and cruelty of American capitalism. Yeah, I mean, this is something, how even rich people from middle class, how much they work, how much they're totally invested. Their entire life is like spent in working for somebody else. Okay, they get their compensation, but you know, so for European intellectual, it's a shock. And it was shock for all of them from Frankfurt School, and they somehow maneuvered, you know, at least they were allowed to speak about Marx, about, in such a terrible times, for left thinking in United States. I mean, entire state apparatus is in organized paranoia against power, unknown power appears on the horizon, and we had Roosevelt with his reforms, how we get rid of that, how we destroy this growing middle working class rights, body of rights, this is the topic. This is the
So
topic.
it sounds like the voices. So to ask a question, it sounds like you think this whole Freudian mixture is really beside the point, or it's distracting from what actually matters, which is the struggle between the classes.
I think that it makes sense for a bulk of middle class people, whatever middle class is. Now there is a huge problem with understanding what middle class is in European frame of thinking and in American frame of thinking. I mean, in European frame of thinking, it would be mostly negative connotation, historically, ideologically, ambitions-wise. In United States, as far as I know, is something positive, like something that everybody should aspire to. But I think that his study is relevant for huge fractions of middle class worldwide, because there are problems that are really psychological and in many induced from society that plays with ambitions, I mean, after Second World War, there is a incredible surge of consumers' ambition. American way of life becomes like there is a global American dream as a leading metaphor of cultural hegemony. I mean, contemporary artists, everybody, Hollywood is decommunized. Contemporary art is engaged in artists didn't know. Pollock didn't know that his paintings are part of CIA project of, introducing contemporary art and American culture as a part of new imperialist hegemony. But it was like that. Now we know from documents that appear that it was a project, state project. Bring contemporary art. They were here in Yugoslavia, in socialist Yugoslavia. You had the exhibition of American modern art as a reward for breaking up with Stalin. So it's as simple as that, and also as how to say, obscure as that. So all the respect to him. A very valuable understanding, but this is the problems of middle class. But then again, most of the working class also aspires to the status of middle class. So I think that he just left the main problem behind it, how the global and local division of labor could contribute to suppressing inherent tendency of capitalism to produce fascist ideas, movements, ideological offspring. This is what they in Frankfurt School have to give up. They had to give up that, and then they are going sideways. I mean, this is not my opinion. This is like
Nebojsa,
left.
Can I just ask, can you make the connection between capitalism and fascism clearer for those of us that aren't as familiar?
Sorry, Mark. I didn't hear what you asked. If you asked me,
can you make the connection between capitalism and fascism clearer?
Yeah. Well, because it was the mission of Frankfurt School to somehow find the solution for explaining fascism without involving capitalism. In the end, Horkheimer had to give up, and he was honest enough to give the opening phrase of his book. I forgot now. Is who doesn't talk about capitalism should be silent, or better should shut up about fascism. He had to say that. openly. This is the first sentence in his book that I can also find and send it to you. Because it is like all theory from Marx, from 18 Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, if you heard of that essay, fantastic essay. This is the first European fascism, probably, like Louis Bonaparte. And always the problem is that capitalist production is very fruitful under authoritarian rule. We see this today in China. We also saw it in the Soviet Union. Only authoritarian rule, only this suppression of individuality, of even human rights. I mean, we can talk. I mean, where capitalism was developed without incredible oppression? Where? It doesn't. Where it was developed, and then in the end, during crisis, fascism didn't appear. There's no such place in the world. Maybe somehow Denmark, people say Sweden, but these are specific cases in which this conflict was somehow source.
Yeah, one thing I think we can ask is also, I mean, reading Marcuse here, discussing him, to me, he does seem to be addressing important aspects of capitalism, right? But he does focus more on maybe something in the tradition of Max Weber, you know, this idea of the rationalization, the iron cage of this, you know, bureaucratic apparatus. And it is true, I also find this, right? It's kind of clear in the essay that he downplays class conflict. And he sees, you know, both ruling class and ruled class, they've become both subservient to this larger whole, which is the bureaucratic apparatus. So he definitely makes that point. But in another way, though, he does seem to be pretty squarely looking at what capitalism is and how it functions. But maybe there is a distance from Marx already with Marcuse. So
first of all, he doesn't take into consideration the fact that in Soviet Union, capitalism is not a ruling model. There is a capitalist mode of production, yes, but it is not a ruling model. So it's much easier for everybody to say there is terror, there are victims. We don't care about that anymore. But this is not the job of theoretician. Job of theoretician, at least Hegelian theoretician, is to go behind what is known towards something that should be understood, you know. And like it's easier to disqualify anything anything different that at least tries to get developed, and to stay on this safe position. Yes, he describes capitalist society, but he describes it as meteorologists would describe climate. This is something inevitable, and you have to adopt to it. You know, like there's no other. Anything else is like some catastrophe. You know, like.
I want to invite. Yeah, so there are a number of hands up. I think Audrey, you were reacting earlier, and also anyone else who wants to, you know, make a comment on this and or anything related. But Audrey, did you want to comment on what Neboise is saying? You were.
Well, I agree with him. I don't know as much of the history as he's talking about, but I did actually look at my notes, especially after I brought up page 27 before, and there was this, I have this note that says, you know, unfreedom versus freedom, and under that I had Soviet regime versus Western capitalism, how they keep each other going. You know, there's like, don't do this because you'll end up like that, or don't, you know, on both sides. And that we're still within the apparatus that I was talking about earlier, or was trying to articulate. And that's strengthening the extra familial authority versus reducing that authority, like the outside structures that are based on the social extension of the household authority, which brings in Hannah Arendt, and how the authority of the I don't know if Neboise would agree with this, but that there's something to what she says, I think, in terms of how the initial authority of the family, of the hierarchical structure of the household, it's just pushed into, somehow got into the social, becomes extension in the social, and that our powers, at least in the West, and I say at least in the West, but I can see it in the East too. So I get lost there in terms of my own ideas. So, but basically, I see it that we're maintaining by keeping adversaries alive, or keeping something going, where we're using the structures that we have within this giant apparatus of domination, and we're maintaining it that way. And the cracks that come up are where we start like, this doesn't work. I'm going to have to make the best of this, or you become totally resistant and rise up. But
that logic of enemies, right?
Yeah.
Like right up until today it's Russia and it's China.
Right. And then I was trying to also say that the difference between, because James brought up, James K. brought up Deleuze, which he usually does, which I really always appreciate. Freud's instinct theory versus Deleuze's discussion on understanding of desire. And I think that that's something to also talk about too, in terms of.
Well, funny you mentioned that. I am thinking, what are we going to? So we've had this kind of a unit, let's say, on Marxism and existentialism, and what comes naturally after is structuralism. Structuralism with Levi-Strauss and Foucault and Deleuze is really a part of that picture to some extent. And they have, but there was especially strong debates between Sartre and Levi-Strauss, and Sartre and Foucault. And there are some nice pieces we can look at that. So I'm thinking we might move in that direction, and that really is kind of the final. I don't want to say gasps, but that's the word that comes to mind. The final kind of word of existentialism before structuralism takes over, and then we have the post-structuralists. So things move, and even I think we could say we could get it even a little more extreme philosophically than existentialism ever was. So, so there's an interesting kind of, there's interesting dialectic there between those two. So that, I'm gonna propose that we do that. It's, coming up, but we can talk more about that in coming weeks. Okay, well, we've got James Cook, and then I think Mark is next in terms of the hands. Yeah, James, take it away.
Thank you. I wanted to mention, everything Nebojsa said was just golden as usual. It was really illuminating, and I think we have a lot of problems. Even though I only read half of this, I admit, which is my problem. I don't necessarily get through 30 pages at a time. And Nebojsa admitted that he didn't read most of it, but he seems to have absolutely fair insight to everything that is being discussed. And one of the things that stands out the most is how anti-Hegelian Marcuse is, and how he actually contradicts Marx as much as he does. So not Marx, but he contradicts Freud, who is kind of the subject of the discussion. He, Freud, instead of talking about the superego as being the instrument of self-repression in the general population, not, in Freud, it's not a class analysis. Freud never becomes, because he wrote Civilization is Discontent, he didn't become a Marxist. He might even mention Marx only in passing. It's just the idea that people get on the wrong side of civilization for reasons, and that's basically what Marx is addressing. And it's the conflict between the super ego and the id. The super ego being a construct that essentially is more powerful than the instincts. But then Marcuse turns that backwards against Freud and says, well, it's really the instincts that matter here. This is what creates the imposition, the suppression of man's libido and so on and so forth, and his freedom. So, and in the Hegelian sense, I mean, he's constantly using absolute contradictions, like freedom is unfreedom, and things like that. So this is exactly one of the main points Hegel argues against, that you can't believe absolute contradictions. And he's doing this all for propaganda reasons. He wants to show us that there can be a non-Soviet style of communism that is good to think about. It's good to have as something in focus. When I was a young man, I had a membership in a communist group and Marxist group, and we had I was living in Toronto, and we had a Montreal contingent, and I said, oh great, we have these French Trotskyists, and it must be great, they must be really interesting people, and because there was a very important social liberation movement in French Canada at the time. So in the 1970s. But they told me, my leaders told me, that these guys are actually new leftists. They're not traditional Marxists. So I went over there. We had a convention in Montreal that year, and went over there and I met these guys and actually went to their meetings. They had a meeting I went to, and it was interesting for me because they were spending a lot. It was a small meeting, and they were spending a lot of time thinking. They were not like very outspoken. They were just very thoughtful about things. So I think maybe this is the kind of thing that these guys, when they said new left, that's what they were talking about. They're the idea that, well, these ideas are very difficult, they're very complex and things like that, and they even involve some of Freud's worst ideas, which I consider, and I want to repeat this from an earlier meeting. His worst ideas is the infantile sexuality and the importance of the Oedipus complex. I don't think those are important ideas in Freud at all, and they're essentially wrongly intended and misleading. I don't think babies have any kind of polymorphism. Doesn't lead their lives. What leads their lives is sensuality and discovery. So I have a completely different attitude towards childhood development than I think Freud did in that sense. Although sociologically, the Oedipus complex could actually mean something. In other words, sociologically, it could be that historically somebody said something about that, or wrote something about that in the chat, that there's a possibility that there could be a kind of an ancient, extremely ancient stage in human evolution of human society, in which the idea of relations between generations, between paternal generations, actually controlled the politics of the tribes. So maybe. Yeah, so there are some possible ramifications of the Oedipus idea. But nonetheless, it doesn't actually appear I don't think it appears that often in modern consciousness. I don't think that's the average relationship between sons and fathers. So I think it's so very far from it. So although I think what Nebojia was saying about what Nebojia was saying about Jordan Peterson, I completely agree with. So I'll stop there because I've been talking for a while. But I want to emphasize that the reliance on psychology to explain the world is a very serious mistake that people make. We can have psychological theories. Somebody's psychological theory can be shocking or completely depressing, as we see in this essay. But we can. But it's this. It is a it's really the whole package, including sociology and the entire total structural outlook, which Hegel was discussing and other philosophers have picked up from him and his successors. These are the some of the most important ideas for analysis, not the idea of juxtaposing ideas and opposing ideas and substituting other ideas. And I don't want to talk forever, but I was going to mention China. China is the real elephant in the room. We no longer have the Soviet Union, but we have an example of a socialist society which has a certain degree of freedom. It's not like our freedom at all, but it's a kind of a freedom where they have their own kinds of social problems. Their problems often consist of things like I've heard one article in the Wall Street Journal. I heard it on a podcast. Was so many older people are taking over the parks to do their Tai Chi and their dance groups and so forth, that the young people don't have as much room for their soccer games and their soccer and lacrosse games and so forth. So, and of course, the government responds to this by building more parks. They build more space out. And the Wall Street Journal thinks this is a big problem. China is just going to go broke trying to satisfy its older population, and this is a terrible society, as we know, and so on and so forth. So socialism develops these problems that have a importantly positive look to the culture there, but then the capitalist society, the ones that are kind of like that is composed of the usurpation of the means of production by the bourgeoisie. You see, there's still a little Marxist in me. Is very quick to say, well, this is actually a negative thing because someone's going to have to pay for this new park space that they're building.
Yeah, thanks for that, James. Just a quick point to somebody, you probably already know this, but a quick comment about just a video. I don't know if somebody mentioned in the chat that maybe it's a focus mechanism. It just kind of keeps clicking and changing the focus as you're speaking. So I don't know, maybe you already know this and just
actually, I was gonna comment on that, Alex. I apologize. I made a change to my audio settings. I'll change it back. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, we've got Mark and Todd. John, I don't know if your hand is up from before. You wanted to make a comment, but let's start.
Okay, thanks, Alex. Can you hear me okay this time?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Well, my question kind of goes in a little bit of a different direction, and I'm just I basically had two questions. One of them is about the relationship between the social and the individual in Marcuse. So I understand that some of us really believe that Marcuse's analysis is somewhat limited. And I know that you wanted to bring up at the beginning of the meeting the ideas of the pleasure principle, the death instinct, the reality principle, and so on. Maybe this question is a way of doing that. You mentioned just a little while ago something about there being an individual level and a societal level in one of the questions that you posed. And on page 3 of the work, Marcuse says that the social need and the individual need diverge. So if the individual needs are based on individual drives, does this mean that the social need implies that there are social drives? To what degree are we ascribing sort of organism-like behavior to civilization or to society? Are drives only predicated of individuals? Can civilization have a libido or have libidinal energy? Can society also have a pleasure principle, not just an individual, or experience a death drive? Can society have a death drive? In addition to relying on the reality principle for its continuance. I'll stop there.
Thanks for that, Mark. I think that's a really insightful question. Because he clearly speaks here of a social need, and in fact says that need may well divert, and it does divert contemporary, I guess, any civilization up until now from the possibilities of liberation. You know, and I think you're asking, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're asking, what is this social need? How do we read this? Is it the same as is there a social libido? Is there a social psyche of some kind? And you know, some people read Hegel actually as implying that, you know, spirit in a large sense has a kind of agency or a kind of, you know, and I mean, I wouldn't expect to see something like that with Marcuse, but yeah, how do we read the social need? What is that? I think that's a great question. As compared to individual needs that he also mentions right here.
Can I just quickly reply to your question, Alex? The reply,
Yeah, sure.
the answer to the question, what is social need, needs a mechanism to be achieved, to be given. So it's up to society. What society? What is society? So if it is about Marx, he in his writings about Paris Commune, so civil war in France, this is the essay. He wrote about Paris Commune as of a model of action in which all individuals, all inhabitants, for example, of one commune, decide in a procedures adopted by all participants in a debate and in political decision making through procedures that are invention at that time. So Paris Commune is not that now model to be followed, but the model of action. So everybody has to have enough time, enough information, enough motivation to participate in this decision making, and then to go after the answer: is there a wish of society, a goal of society? The theoretician that I posted the book, one recent book about, is very much focused on this critique of consumerism, because it's easy to say, okay, we are all corrupted, we go after traumas in our job to supermarket to compensate. This is very easy critique, you know. So it's a complex question, but the mechanism, in fact, what capitalism is perfect in is preventing us to search for that mechanism. That's for sure. It's perfect in this aspect.
Thanks, voice. Todd, I'm wondering if you might have anything to say on this, or maybe something related.
Oh, I guess I think of social need here, and I could be misreading this, but it to me it means not that there's some, you know, collective, mysterious, you know, social instinct or will to power, but it's what is the need? What does society need to perpetuate itself? That's how I read this. And so society needs, you know, and then, you know, consonant with the rest of his argument, the society needs us to, you know, continue to like defer gratification and not just go for immediate satisfactions and immediate pleasure. It needs us to, you know, buy into a work ethic and keep going to work and all that stuff that, you know, and that's what a civilization will need to continue into the future, right? We need to keep working, as opposed to individual satisfaction. But that may be too simple a read of this. Can I go ahead and talk about a couple other things? Is that okay?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay.
And we can come back also to Mark's question.
Okay. Oh, I'm sorry, Mark. Do you want to say more? No. Yes. No.
Just that in your response, you referred to society as a self. You said,
well, I didn't
social...
mean to personify it. I mean, I tried to ask, for me, it's a functional issue. Like, what does a certain entity, under what conditions will that entity persist into the future versus not? And so, would society persist if we all just satisfied our individual short-term kinds of desires, or not? I take your point. It sounded a little more homuncular than I wanted it to, or whatever, more like a subject.
I mean, I'm thinking of a couple of things just to throw out there on this, and then Todd, you can take it away with the
Sure.
other comments. One thing that comes to mind is the struggle between the reality principle and the pleasure principle. And it sounds like for Marcuse, the reality principle kind of is what gives rise to, well, a certain kind of civilization, right? The civilization that we know, which is repressive and involves domination and so on. He says pretty clearly, well, that comes out of the clash with scarcity and with the necessities of nature. That's where domination comes out of. But he does also mention towards the end of the essay that for him, civilization at root actually comes out of pleasure. And he's pretty adamant about that point. I'm sure if I can find the exact reference right now, but that it is ultimately the work of Eros, right? The work of the pleasure principle that brings us together in these larger unities. And maybe one way to think of the agency, I think maybe a Freudian way, I'm not qualified really to say that, but maybe a Freudian way of thinking of the agency of society is based on the different agencies of the individual energies, right? Or the individual psyche, that it gets split into an ego, id underlying it, and a superego. And perhaps we could say that the superego is, in a sense, the agency of society, but it only works through individual psyches, because I also don't think Freud has a vision of some kind of, metaphysical or a kind of almost occult social self or social agent in addition, over and above all the individuals. I don't think that's very Freudian or Marcusean for that matter, but it's kind of just speculations here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know, Mark, if that's ringing any or setting anything off for you, or
I was just throwing this idea out there. I figured that there had been someone that had conceptualized it like this.
And I think
sometimes
go
ahead.
Yeah. No, I just wanted to say, I think the question also might come up with structuralism and, people like Lacan, where this notion of structure is wrong. And somebody might ask, well, what is structure? How does that act? What's the energy behind that, or the force behind that? And the answer there might be something like, well, it's language. Language is doing these. Language has certain effects. It does certain things, maybe not like an intentional agent, not like a person, but it has a certain kind of force. So that might be an alternative answer. I don't think Marcuse is a structuralist, but somebody like Lacan might go in that direction.
Yeah, in terms
I
of
think you,
the social, oh yeah, okay. It's interesting that the Freudian model is it's a kind of a Platonic, model that's in reverse, right? An inverse, so that the forms are, instead of the forms to be on top, the forms are at the bottom, and and so the eros would be, what is creating everything. But the obstruction of the eros, is the life force. And what happens is that because of this element of domination, the patriarchal domination that the primal father begins this process of domination that obstructs the eros, and that's what otherwise the social entity you're talking about would not be this kind of repressive entity without this, if it was without this kind of domination. But because of that domination, the social entity, the social becomes more of a super ego, a kind of master signifier. The the symbolic order would be the kind of hierarchy of the mass, hierarchy with a master signifier at the top.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, James. So Todd, let's turn over to you, and then Phil is in the queue.
I really liked everything James Cook said, and just and just to pile on further to Freud a little bit. I'm always struck by how difficult it is to like a really good Freudian, a really clever Freudian, I think, can argue any position, right? I mean, what's interesting, for example, about the idea of the resolution of the Oedipal complex is it's so chock full of explanations for every possible feeling a son can have about his father, right? So, the son views the father as a rival, hates the father, is guilty and massively represses that desire to kill the father. In the repression, you introject the father, right? You identify with the father, you take the father inside, and that becomes the superego. But your hostility to the father continues to live on by having that superego be punitive and be a kind of a crushing ego ideal. I mean, it's a really complex and interesting theory, and can justify, or can, stand as a kind of retrospective, theoretical justification for any feeling that might obtain in that relationship, hatred, envy, love, identification, et cetera, et cetera. So I generally find, psychoanalysis it's really hard to argue against, because, any given emotional response or its opposite is potentially, it can be psychoanalytically understood and explained. But I do want to mention, there is a younger generation of social psychologists who are non-Freudian and who continue to try to understand the transmission of political beliefs, from one generation to the next, and to understand types of families and family organizations, and how that, might correlate with certain kinds of beliefs. So, I mean, I've relatively recently become aware that there are people kind of working in this area. I don't have any particular names in mind, but it does continue to be an interesting area of research. I want to just think about for a moment whether we need, and I'm going to argue we don't, that we don't need all the Freudian conceptual stuff to to understand some of the phenomena that Marcuse is talking about. So, this idea, for example, that that as the fundamental paradox that as civilization as we become more productive as a society, as civilization progresses, because it depends on certain forms of internal repression and deferred gratification, all that stuff, that there's this paradox of having less and less scarcity but less ability to enjoy it, to appreciate it. And I think here of the fact that, this is written, I think, in the middle 50s, and Eros and Civilization, the second edition, comes out in the middle 60s, right? So, and that's a very interesting time, right? America is dominating the global economy in the 50s and 60s. And so you have a rising, middle class, which is, has, a fairly broad level of material comfort. And now admittedly, we are, there are, there's still a large, poor population. There are, the situation of people of color in the United States, et cetera. But that one might argue that the children of the middle class raised in the 50s and 60s in this moment of relative, kind of economic hegemony of American capitalism, and relatively well off, actually without, they weren't necessarily continuing to internalize a highly conformist, we got to go to work and put our nose to the grindstone kind of ethic. In fact, we have, the rise of the counterculture at exactly that time, right? So in this period of relatively less scarcity, we do have a generation that is, exploring, exploring all the stuff that got explored in the 60s. And now, admittedly, one could argue that, we also had the invention of, the discovery of LSD, and the Vietnam War, and the rise of the civil rights movement. So there were other sources of social discord that kind of ruptured, the conformism of the 50s. But I find it striking that is a moment in which a large chunk of a generation was considering alternate lifestyles and a more libidinal civilization, as it were. And what's also interesting to me is that the kind of failure of our last 50 years in sharing our resources more equitably and moving toward perhaps a more joyful economy or joyful society isn't because of some subtle internal Freudian dynamic of the more civilization achieves, the more repressed people are, et cetera, et cetera. It really is about the reimposition of scarcity. Capitalism has been very successful in the last 50 years, or at least American capitalism has been very successful at redistributing resources, toward the top of the income distribution, and kind of reimposing a level of economic insecurity, that even if, and to the point where I think even if you're reasonably well off, it's still in your head, that things could go wrong. I could have a one serious medical problem could send me to the poorhouse, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we've reinstituted a level of economic security very, very broadly. So the point is, we've returned to scarcity in a certain way, or at least psychologically speaking, in American capitalism, I think. So I'm not sure we need the Freudian concepts to kind of understand this. Let me just point out that there's another much simpler idea here that might from political science that might make sense of the kind of cultural upheavals of the 60s, and which is the idea of the revolution of rising expectations. That this is a common idea in trying to understand social change, social reform, revolutionary movements, et cetera, that in historical moments when you have rising expectations, when you have some change that is benefiting some section of society, you're going to get people anticipating that that's going to continue, and that in itself will drive a certain level of either resistance or social engagement or political engagement. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Todd. Okay, Phil is up in the queue, and Phil, why don't you have the last word? I think I see we're at the 3-hour mark, so good to break for the day.
This has been a very good discussion, and it just seems to me like the two competing baselines of material or the reality principle versus the libido principle or pleasure principle. I think it's something that you have to work at in a dynamic way. My thought is that in some sense, first of all, I don't like the pleasure principle because it sort of put an emphasis on a kind of hedonism that ultimately is related back to kind of a materialism, in a sense, that you have rising expectations of goods, and your joy is related to the ever production or consumption of more and more goods, which is really the basis of capital, that in a sense that has siphoned off its domination of the human spirit. The Eros principle is a little bit better, although I prefer just call it the spirit. And so the relationship between the spirit and the material is the dual reality that kind of have to coexist. I definitely go on the side of the human spirit, which is sort of the life force principle, I suppose you could call it that. And the problem I have with it, as I think about it, is that even in a land of plenty, there still needs to be somebody or something that produces the other side, which is the material to sustain that. And I wonder whether even in a utopian situation where everybody is free to become an artist, a philosopher, a scientist, whatever, these great things that we all want to do. Well, I shouldn't say we all want to do, but many of us want to do, whether that doesn't ultimately command a kind of slave culture. In other words, somebody has to do the work. And I don't mean to quite stress slave quite so harshly, because I want to use this word in a way just to emphasize that somebody has to do the work. And, whether you call that indentured servants or just workers, and they would be rewarded by materials. Because, when you're doing your philosophy, I suppose you could talk the philosopher into like giving up like 2 hours a day or whatever, or 5 hours a week to go and actually do some physical work or something, And that's a difference between work and labor, by the way. Labor is just sort of like just sort of drudgery that you don't want to do. You just fulfill your duty. And work is something, whether you're doing science or art or philosophy or whatever, is something that you actually get pleasure out of. You enjoy it. You enjoy the knowledge and all the work you put into it. I suppose you could even be a carpenter and enjoy that, like just the work of just doing it, do that. And so we have to satisfy that. Now, you could say, well, maybe we have advanced to such a stage that, we could just make machines our slaves. And, but then somebody has to go at least watch over the machines in some sense. So somebody has to do the work somewhere. So you're either going to have to divide that on some level, no matter how advanced you are in producing this sort of material culture that's necessary. Somebody's got to do the work, and whether you divide it, distribute it in a way that everybody does some, or there's actually a slave class, and that's all they do, And I hate to put it that way, but almost seems like not everybody could be a philosopher and nobody does any work. Nobody does any farming. Nobody, builds the building. None of that sort. It's like it just doesn't work. So we have to work that one out. And that's the kind of tensional relationship that we're always struggling and balancing. And I don't want it balancing to mean like, let's find exactly the midpoint where the scales, are just equal. I mean, that's always a dynamic relationship that you'll have to go through as the conditions change. And so there's a problem, on one hand, you become a total capital market. And what you do as you enjoy is it's just merely consumerism, or whether everybody become a philosopher and you have a slave culture that does all the work, and they don't get to think about philosophy whatsoever. So it can't be extremes. There has to be this sort of balancing act of the two-way equation. That's it, Phil.
Yeah, great points, Phil. I think, as far as I know, under socialism, Soviet style socialism, communism, that problem didn't go away. It was still very much, and I think technically, when I've heard Marxists refer to this as the problem of who's going to clean up the shit at the end of the day. Because even if you're in a communist society, there's still going to be less rewarding work to be done, right? And I think, one thing, yeah.
Sorry, I was just going to say the French situationist response to that, I think, was let the children clean up the shit because they really love mucking around in shit.
Are they gonna clean that up? Or are they gonna make a bigger mess out of it?
Exactly.
Sounds like the French way.
Yeah, exactly.
Is if we are about to clean the shit, we, for example, we would be some engineers would invent machine to do it instead of them in 10 days. Don't worry. No one would clean the shit after that ever.
Well, so a couple of points. Marcuse, not in this paper, but in Eros and Civilization, he makes this distinction between he calls it, I think, socially necessary repression, and then surplus repression. And it really is a kind of an extension, a mirroring of Marx's. Marx has a similar distinction between socially necessary labor, and then I think then it was also surplus or socially necessary value, maybe a surplus value, something along these lines. And Marcuse says, in any civilization, there's going to be some level of repression that's necessary. Like people are going to wear clothes out in public, for example, and there's going to be some level of work that will have to be done. There's just no way around that. But there's a difference between that and then all the surplus repression, which is no longer necessary.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing, just to expand on, I think the voice you mentioned, the machines. I personally think right now, with the advent of AI and how quickly things are developing, we may well be in a, you know, in a new situation, or in a place where the possibility of, you know, a robot cleaning up the shit may be becoming real, you know, and I don't know what that's going to look like exactly, but, you know, I mean, AGI, general artificial intelligence, is right around the corner, and robotics is really moving fast as well. So I think that's something to think about, because we may be moving towards a stage where, you know, there's going to be suddenly a lot more of the repression that we experience is going to become surplus repression, kind of slip into that category, that side of the accounts. And that might mean a lot of things. I mean, to a Marcusian, that might mean there's going to be a surplus aggression that's going to be looking to get released, you know. Or it might mean, you know, we're closer to communism than we think. And all those utopian dreams of, you know, producing, and I think, is this what you're quoting, Todd? Yeah, hunting in the morning, you know, the Marxist dream, fishing in the afternoon, criticizing after dinner. That might be becoming even more realistic as we go forward. So, yeah, those are some of my thoughts anyway.
Hey, Alex, for next week, are we going to read Bataille, or is it Sartre's essay?
Let's read Bataille. I'm gonna, because it's kind of flows out of this, you know, not directly out of Marcuse, but there's some affinities. Let's read Bataille, and then we can go to Sartre after that. And I'm gonna edit the event descriptions to reflect that.
Just to comment on your latest what you said now, Alex, is I just think that this is the situation of the wrong train. When you are in the wrong train, all stations are wrong, you know. So, and I think that in fact this sentence that is underlined here on our screen, at least it is on my screen. On the other hand, individual satisfaction itself may be subordinated to a social need that limits and diverts these possibilities. I think that this is in fact escape from the concept of social being or species being, if we want. And this is exactly what Felipe was mentioning, this young Marx, 1844. This is Jewish contribution to Jewish question, a difference between human emancipation and political emancipation, etc., etc. So I'm grateful to Todd that posted this very simple explanation how in fact in a imagined communist society division of labor would be abolished. The present, the one that is the product of class society, historical development of class society. But the problem is that for us, middle class people, middle class educated people, this is a huge problem. This is existential or nothing. That we all of a sudden see ourselves as not necessarily not needed. I mean, we are not in the essential jobs that we discovered as a humanity during COVID epidemic. We all of a sudden discovered what are essential jobs. People that work in supermarket, people that you know, sewage system, maintain sewage system, electricity. They are essential jobs, not our like sophisticated professions, you know, like. So I think that the part of the problem, and this is again related to fascism and historical development as an ideology of a middle class in crisis. The problem is that whenever it is about division of labor, radical change of division of labor, it is about depriving of the most privileged social formations of their privileged position. And this is ourselves, I mean, abstract ourselves, middle class and upper middle class, global, not only of the West. We have to give up this privilege, accumulated historical. We keep global knowledge, globally developed knowledge under our, we privatize it as our class property. And we don't, the panic about artificial intelligence is only about somebody else will be intelligent, like somebody that we are not in control. He's not our classmate. I'm dramatizing, and also
Right.
I don't know.
Well, with
But
the sounds like
there should
sounds
be
like
social as a concept. There's no
Yeah.
social being in Marcuse's work, and there's it's betrayal of Marx. I'm okay. Marx is not some dogma that should be forever reproduced.
So you're saying for Marx, his emphasis is his priority is the social, the class consciousness, is prior or takes precedence over the individual, right? So it sounds like Marcuse is recognizing the individual, and that's where he comes to be more closer to Sartre in acknowledging the importance of the individual. And he's talking about a kind of a totalitarianism that is a threat to the individual. So he's talking about more than just Marxism and Freudianism, but he's emphasizing the importance of the individual, because in our civilization, at our progress so far, we can afford to acknowledge the importance of the individual, given all the technological advances that we have, instead of just totalizing the individual into the mass. Okay, or
not into the mass. Sorry, not into the mass. It is into a concept. Species being is a concept of universal individual that is a member, of course, of society, and whose well-being depends of the capacity of society to develop its individual qualities. This is a social being, but not like civic individual in a bourgeois society that inherited property, that inherited education and social and cultural capital, and then asks itself how we are not equal. And then, I mean, it's like it's the issue of Jewish question, the contribution to Jewish question. I don't know what's the title of Marx's work. This is his one of his crucial works. This is in fact Introduction to Capital. How individual gets emancipated as a human, not as individual in bourgeois society. This is totally different. These are two totally different things, and this is why the goal of bourgeois revolution is not fulfilled. Only in Haiti for a while, or through Sankilot riots, or through revolutions in Russia, in Yugoslavia, in Albania, in China, the goal of French Revolution was at least for a while, or at least on an ideological horizon, fulfilled. Yes, equality, brotherhood, freedom of the oppression, exactly this oppression. Of course, comes the new oppression, because this is historical situation in which we have to develop industry and to modernize society. And of course, it will be terror. I mean, terror in every aspect, in terror of an individual that has to work. But for example, in Yugoslavia, after the revolution, people were going to work voluntarily like crazy. It was decades of culture, subculture of voluntary work. And half of that work is, because this is how society rose from pre-industrial to some sort of semi-developed industrial society. People work.
It sounds, Du Bois, maybe would you say at that point, let's take that kind of work, voluntarism. Would you call that more of a the kind of libidinal work Marcuse is describing, which involves, connectedness? It's not alienated labor. It's work that's, fulfills the people who do it and connects them and so on.
Absolutely, but it is not voluntarism. It is, I don't know, voluntarism is, I'm not sure that I'm in control of the language enough. Like voluntarism
well, that's you could say that's a bourgeois concept, right? Of,
cultural not voluntarism in terms, now we are due to our motivation do something. It is not that. It is like a conscious decision and dedication to the development of precondition for every individual in society to become, let's say, Marxist social being. Of course, it was not possible, but for so many people, it became like pretty much of a reality of their lives. This is why you have this broad Yugo nostalgia today all over Yugoslavia. Everybody's like what we got after breakdown of socialist project. It's like, okay, not for everybody. It's not that easy to discuss, but I want to say that this yellow sentence, highlighted sentence, is exactly the opposition of Marx's concept of social being, on which he based his theory of human emancipation, with his interaction between individual and collective in terms for, it ends up in this pretty much banalized sentence, everyone according to its possibilities and takes according to its needs. I mean, in a final result, it should be that, but before that, we have to do what Paris Commune did. They had to erase all the existing division of labor. Why? Because all the upper classes went to the side of enemy, and not only left them to the Prussian army, but also signed the contract to pay reparations to Prussia of some, for example, something like $500 billion today. And of course, ordinary people would pay that through tax. And this is why they resisted, not because some incredible ideal. Like they had to fight for their existence, for their future. And they immediately came up with the model that enabled everybody to feel engaged in that fight, to recognize its own goal, its own future in reasons of that fight. And this is why Marx called it the model of action. Once the situation is, this is how revolutions happened later. Deprive the masses of any chance of future. This is why they happened in catastrophes like world wars, etc. Deprived masses just didn't see anything else. These are conservative peasantry that in French Revolution resisted the revolution. In these peripheral countries, they joined the revolutionary movement because they saw it as like basis existential change for them, for their class. So this is why this is now like middle class disappointment with the capacities of bourgeois society. Of course, there are problems. There in Marxist like this, let's say like radical Marxist circles. This is called psychologization. To say psychologization, explaining social processes through psychology of like some general psychology of man, like if man is not predestined, but man's psychology, man is what he works, what he does, what she does, so everybody is different, like you can, but there is a model, and Freud worked on that model of urban middle class and personality, which is the dominant personality of 20th century, globally dominant, that is relevant for research and for understanding of its influence in understanding the world, because it's cultural hegemonic thought, so it is relevant, but like it
seems to me like from the Marxist perspective, then any kind of addition to the basic Marxist model is like a kind of perversion, right? Would that be fair to say? Like here, because I would say, Marcuse is pretty nuanced in the way he brings Freud. He has some disagreements with Freud, for example, and but does accept much of his theory for sure. But I think he is also very sympathetic to the Marxist view, right, of base versus superstructure, of economic determination. He even says in this essay somewhere that, for him, really the psychological phenomena come out of political and historical phenomena, and psychology is a kind of, almost like a reflection of what happens in the objective world. So, but I do wonder if, from a Marxist perspective, just the fact that psychology is brought in maybe is already problematic, because we're adulterating Marxism, and that can, that can shift the focus, shift the emphasis, and so on. Does that make sense?
Oh, okay. I'm not any dogmatic Marxist or something. If I'm Marxist at all, I'm just scared of eliminating. It's not Marxist. It's like basic economic theory of our system. Just ignoring it, we are immediately in this wrong train, or proverbial wrong train. So. As for upgrading on Marxist psychology, but how Marx is not like how to disconnect Marx from psychology of individual? Who wrote about fetishism of commodities? I mean, entire chapters of Capital of Grundrisse is about fetishism. This is entirely psychology, but this is psychology as a medium of relation of individual with society, capitalist society, with the class division, with exploitation and extraction and surplus value and all. I mean, all the basic of Marxist theory. Not only Marxist, it is also Ricardo and Smith, etc., etc. So it is basis of our existence. We are somehow coded with this contact with material production, or distance from material production. This is another layer. We are distanced. We are privileged so that we don't have to engage into cleaning sewage system. And this is essential for our existence. And then from that position of alienation, we go into some other area of which is more important for our class. Like if you ask like these dogmatic Marxists, they will say that we are parasitic class, that we are parasites on working class material work. So it's a question how and if we can judge our own privilege, and if we are willing to do this, or it's better to go. And I think that it comes from Hegel as well. It's like, let's negotiate what we are going to do with the revolution, the experience of French Revolution. We want it a little bit because we will get rid of this feudal, antiquities, but we are afraid of the masses that we need, whose help we need to overthrow them. And then there is negotiation, there is dialectics, what is good for us, what is bad for us, and so, yeah, and I think that, like, after all that happened in Second World War and all that we saw, it's somehow, out of the point, in this time, the question is how the new empire will deal with the legacy of imperialism and colonialism of European powers. This is the main global question. And it entails global and local division of labor, technical and societal division of labor. He can complain about bureaucracy, but which bureaucracy? At that moment, bureaucracy of United Nations is very productive and very welcome world, let's say, bureaucracy. So it's like, the world is not united, it is pacified for a period, but so many conflicts are boiling or are about to boil. The Chinese Revolution, we don't know what is going on, that almost billion people. What will happen in India after all the experience? What about this communist, disaster in Eastern Europe? These are the issues, and I don't think that this theory deals with it. Also existentialism itself. It's like escape. It's escapism. How to put it.
Can I make
Yeah.
one quick point though about psychology and Marxism? It's not like Marx does not have a psychology, right? I mean, the discussion of the progressive immiseration of the proletariat, the rise of class consciousness, false consciousness. I mean, there's an implicit psychology in Marx about how these things work, how they're transmitted in certain relations of production, et cetera, et cetera. So they may not be spelled out, and frankly they aren't terribly sophisticated. But I don't think you can do without a psychological dimension in Marx's theory. There's a point at which, all social, movements or all social laws, as it were, all social, concepts like revolution they have to mean something at the individual level, and it has to be, like how people define their true interests versus false interests, their preferences, their sense of trust and solidarity with others, et cetera, et cetera. These are all psychological questions that really bear, I think, on Marxism. Also, in terms of commodity fetishism, the main, Lukács wrote a very important essay in History and Class Consciousness called Commodity Fetishism, in which he lays out what he takes to be Marx's notion of this. And interestingly, it's not at all psychological. It's this first conception of commodity fetishism is really about how when you take the commodity out of the totality, take the commodity out of the full labor process that has produced it, and cut it off from, you're looking at a beautiful pair of shoes, but you're not thinking about the fact that, some laborer overseas had to make those shoes, and someone had to, raise the cattle to make the leather and all that stuff. So you take it out of the productive process, and that in itself fetishizes the commodity as an object in a market economy, as opposed to an object that's truly a product of human labor. And the Frankfurt School got picked this up, and it really is the Frankfurt School that psychologizes the concept later, and begins to read commodity fetishism in a very psychological way. That is, we project onto the commodity alienated aspects of subjectivity that we have disowned, like charm and excitement, and et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, just a couple thoughts.
Agreed. You're right.
Can I come in with a statement about this? Psychology, I think something like a Marxism, and I think, just like Todd just said, it has to involve a kind of like references to psychology, and perhaps the main emphasis of commodity fetishism is not psychological for Marx, and it's introduced in the Frankfurt School. And I think what happens is that these intellectuals love to introduce psychological concepts, and they can be more or less correct or completely wrong. And I think I said earlier, I disagree with the gist of the concept of alienation of labor, because there's actually something in labor that contributes to self-intention and self-consciousness. So I think, which is ignored, in Marx's discussion and discussions about it. On the other hand, I don't think it's wrong to have a psychological notion, like existentialism is built on a psychological notion of that is part of the phenomenological process. The idea that in part of the phenomenological process, there's a destabilization of reality, instead of like having this idea in Marcuse of competing realities, and in some other ideologies, we have the idea of a destabilization of one's phenomenology, points of destabilization of phenomenological realization, which is criticized in Sartre. Obviously, it's a point of criticism for his opponents, You can't have things that are melting in your hands, for example. I mean, except for maybe M&Ms. But so the or chocolates without coverings. But yeah, so these psychological notions from existentialism, perhaps originating in Heidegger, who said that to understand phenomenology, one has to understand temporality in general and the effects of time. There is a real world connection with psychology, but it has to be understood structurally. You can't sort of like just take psychological ideas out of the blue, construct them, and say, well, this is going to affect our sociology. Alienation is going to affect it, or our feelings of guilt relating to our relationships with our parents. Which I understand that's really important for Lacan, and people like that. So we kind of like and probably Deleuze. So we want to sort of like be well read and read all these things, but there is kind of like a good psychology that sort of contributes to one's structural knowledge of the gestalt of something, or the whole of something, which was Hegel's, always Hegel's emphasis. Always understand totalities. Don't pretend to understand existence based on partial knowledge. So so if we understand these totalities, then we can start to think about the psychologies that are affected by existence, and the totalities that totalities that are and how they're affected by the intervention of the mind into existence, which obviously is psychology. So I just wanted to sort of throw that out as a kind of like a wet sponge, so we could have fun playing a game with a wet sponge. It's not all about psychology as a way of understanding the whole world. No, but there are psychological ideas that are really useful and really good. There's other psychological ideas that are a little bit questionable, and I think some of these come up in Marx. But so many people are enchanted with this idea that there's a usurpation of capital, that there's a by the bourgeoisie, and no one can sort of like throw that off. I haven't heard anyone say, "Oh, I disagree with that idea." Well, we've got to say, well, there's this kind of like driving logic behind Marxism, even if you don't agree with his dialectical materialism. It's kind of like you got to kind of respect his economics. So that's what.
James, do you think of in the way of class consciousness, like that Marx in fact insisted on development of a class consciousness of proletariat, which is like, of course, also in some aspect the psychological profile of a class in struggle.
Yeah, thank you, Nebojsa. Yeah, it could exist. I mean, it is a I think it exists up and down. In other words, it's your loyalty to your company. Sometimes the class consciousness is there. You're loyal to a company. We have companies in the world today that are actually somewhat employee controlled. There are employee owned companies and things like that. So you could it's a continuum, but in the idea of capitalist crisis, you have you might have spikes of class consciousness. I think it has to be looked at that way. You can't see it as a universal, although it's easy to talk about it in a universal, like we're all coal miners in West Virginia, kind of idea. But it's not really that way 100%. Some of us are just inhabiting the streets of New York City, working for some capital firm or something like that. And who's to say that somebody in West Virginia is more alienated than we are? And so that's my point, is that it's kind of like there's a general sense of alienation in not being entitled to the product of your own work. But on the other hand, there's the there's a kind of like a standard of living that reflects the wishes of the population at large, not just the bourgeoisie. And that standard of living actually becomes a factor in things like issues like class consciousness. Are you more likely to trust your boss than you are to trust a leader of a political party, for example? That maybe the leader of the political party is a little less interesting than what your boss has to say about the exciting projects that your company is involved in, you know, and things like that. So, or just you're earning a living, you know, just your sort of like resignation to your daily existence, which sounds so depressing in this kind of Marcusean view, or can be really depressing if you're working 14 hours a day, like some people that Marx knew of had been doing. So, but that situation in Europe changed, by the way. That didn't persist universally for very long. There was a situation. Thank you.
Okay, well, this might be a good, yeah, thanks, James, for the comments. This might be a good place to call it a day for today. Thanks, everyone, for coming out. Why don't we meet again next week, and let's read the Bataille piece and see what he has to say about existentialism. And Bataille, coming out of more, he was very interested in mysticism, actually. So, you know, it's a slightly different slant, but he was also very interested in Marx. So he is a kind of a curious curious figure. So it should be interesting to read him. So let's do that, and we can take it from there.
Thank you, Alex. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good week. See you in a week.
Bye.
We'll have a big bataille next week.